The Supreme Court this week heard high-stakes arguments over President Trump's efforts to limit birthright citizenship. The rule saying anyone born in the U.S. is automatically a citizen. The White House argues that it should only apply to babies whose parents are legally living and settled here. Our state playing a major role in this legal battle, with Washington's Attorney General spearheading a coalition of more than 20 states challenging the president's order, arguing it violates the 14th Amendment's promise of equal citizenship. Several conservative justices seemed skeptical of the administration's position yesterday, questioning how it squares with more than a century of precedent. A ruling is expected later this term, and it could redefine who is and who is not an American for generations. Well, as the nation watches this case unfold, Washington is once again at the center of a major constitutional showdown. State Attorney General Nick Brown joining us live tonight to discuss. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Joyce.
So, Mr. Attorney General, before we get to the Supreme Court case, we learned, of course, today that President Trump fired U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi. Just your reaction to that news today?
Well, my big picture takeaway is what we've seen over the past year from the Department of Justice is really disappointing and frustrating on multiple levels. They have departed from the norms and the independence that the Department of Justice has exercised for generations. They have totally retreated from its core mission of protecting people's civil rights, and AG Bondi was at the head of that. And worse for me is that she seemed intent to go after the president's political opponents at his direction. And we saw countless examples of AG Bondi targeting people that President Trump just did not like, and trying and failing multiple times to get those folks indicted. So I think it's a positive change. Of course, I'm not particularly optimistic that the next person will do any better. But AG Bondi's legacy to me is very disappointing.
Let's turn now to the Supreme Court arguments on birthright citizenship. Why was it important for Washington to be out front on this?
Well, Washington has led the nation on protecting people's core liberties and rights, and we have a strong legacy of protecting people who are immigrants in this state, going way back to the Vietnam War, when we were one of the first states to let refugees in after the war. And we have stood up and wanted to continue that legacy. So that's first and foremost. Second, what was that it was just so blatantly unconstitutional and un-American that we could not simply watch while the president tried to rewrite the Constitution. And so Washington was proud to be the first state in the nation to challenge that lawsuit. Really, having listened to the arguments yesterday, I'm anticipating that the states and the ACLU will prevail in that case. But it was important for us to lead, given Washington's history and legacy.
And then let's talk about what we heard yesterday. What struck you most about how the justices approached this during oral arguments? And was there anything surprising in their questions or answers?
Well, as you noted when you were introing this issue, a number of the more conservative justices really pushed back on the administration and seemed very skeptical of the arguments, the legal arguments that the Solicitor General was trying to make on behalf of the president and the administration. And that's because really, once you start to push and peel away at the administration's arguments, they are contrary explicitly to important Supreme Court precedent. And at the end of the day, they just do not hold up to a thorough legal analysis. But I think maybe even more importantly than that is that at its heart, this was an attempt by the president to rewrite our Constitution based on his own view of who and who should not be an American. And these are big, important policy debates, and we have a process in the United States of America under our Constitution to make constitutional amendments. And so if you want to change the way that we define citizenship or residency or domicile, there is a process to go through that. And in this issue, you have to amend the Constitution. No one president can simply rewrite it with an executive order. And I think the justices were very skeptical that the president had that ability, had that authority, and I would anticipate that we will prevail once this is ultimately resolved.
And so, in your mind, does it tell you how the court is leaning, and are you optimistic at how this is all going to turn out?
Well, based on the arguments, I'd rather be us than them at this point. You don't ever want to try to base your decision on just the oral arguments, but the combination of the arguments and the briefing and the history here, I think, indicates that we will prevail in this matter. And the ACLU's arguments, I thought, were very strong yesterday, backing up the state's positions. And so I would anticipate that we would win with a strong majority. But at the end of the day, you cannot predict those things. But I cannot imagine a case where any Supreme Court, including this one, would not agree with our core foundational arguments.
Well, looking ahead, just in case, are there next steps that you're already considering to safeguard citizenship rights?
Well, look, if we prevail in this matter, then we maintain the status quo, and that the ability to be an American is defined based on where you were born and not who your parents were. And so we expect to prevail and will not have to change anything. Of course, if for some reason the justices went the other way, then we would have to abide by that law. The Supreme Court is the law of the land. But it would be a sea change, not only in the law, but in just the logistical and administrative process. Right now we have babies born in our hospitals every day across this country whose citizenship sometimes is not known and undefined, and states are responsible for issuing their important founding documents, their social security numbers, their birth certificates. And it would be unworkable in the short term, certainly, that if we lost this case, how we would administer that system. I think it would create a lot of chaos, but we're optimistic that won't happen.
Well, again, a ruling is expected later this term, which could redefine who is and is not an American. Attorney General Brown, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.